Got one with the faces. We got two.
You had the slides up there for a second.
Today?
Yeah. It was on HDMI 3. Now it's on HDMI 1.
Oh, this is over here. That's over there. Hey, that works though. Confused, but good. This will work. You can see the slides pretty
Yeah.
well. Now, advance them. Okay, let me see. Jamie, could you talk to me real quick? Can you hear me, Jamie? No, can't.
I can hear you.
You can.
Yes, this is Regina.
Oh, thanks. You can hear me. Okay. And I can hear you, so that solves my problem.
All right.
Okay. Did you want or anything?
No, I'm fine. Sorry, I have a document.
And all right. Yes, I'm gonna. Well, can't tell. Gotta start here with the mic. All right. Let's see what we got. Here. Okay. Okay, welcome everyone. I'm going to zoom in a bit. Okay, thank you for your patience. We are getting set up here at the Catholic Center in Buffalo. My first time teaching here, so I'm getting used to the technology and figuring it all out. We've got Joseph is here in the class with me, and we've got a bunch of folks on Zoom. We may have another join us here in class in a few minutes. I'm going to go ahead and start by opening us with prayer, and then we'll begin talking about our course. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Direct we beseech thee, O Lord, our thoughts by thy matchless inspiration, that every word and work of ours may always begin from thee and by thee be happily ended through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, I want to welcome each of you to Archaeology in the Bible. We are coming to you from Buffalo, New York, like I said. I'm Charles Hughes Huff. I'm really pleased to see all of you in class. And I hope you're all enjoying your Tuesday evening. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what we're going to do tonight. We're going to start with talking about our class community, what it's going to look like, get to know each other a little bit, just to say hello to each other. And then we're going to talk about what is archaeology, how does archaeology relate to the Bible. We're going to talk about the ancient Middle East. We're going to give a brief history of archaeology and talk about some important introductory concepts. And I'm going to start out by introducing myself. I'm Charles Hughes Huff. I'm born and raised in Texas, educated mostly in Chicago. Most of my adult life was spent in Chicago. I'm honored now to take up residence in beautiful Western New York, where I moved in August last year. So I'm coming up on my 1 year in Western New York anniversary. I've loved every second of it thus far. Wonderful place. I was really privileged to study at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago for grad school. So a picture of part of our museum. Our classes were directly above this Lamassu from ancient Mesopotamia. So that was fun to know he was down there listening in. And we were part then of a long history of archaeological endeavor. And I got to study archaeology with some very good archaeologists. I myself am not an archaeologist, but what they call a philologist, who studies the texts that people dig up. But I took a lot of courses in archaeology and a comprehensive exam in it, and have been on several digs. And more importantly, we'll be inviting you to join me and St. Bernard's on a dig next summer in Jordan, a Moabite site in Jordan, where a friend of mine is the dig director, and we can get a second class in archaeology if you're so inclined. You could take with us there in Jordan for 3 weeks or 6 weeks, depending on what you like, but we will talk more about that. But archaeology is a wonderful discipline. It's one of my favorite things in the world to study. I'm married to Heather, who is an editor, writer, and lecturer. And she's, I'm the father to Molly and Lincoln, who live in Madison, Wisconsin. Heather lives with me in New York. My kids live with their mom in Wisconsin. Could you get the other guy at the door?
Yeah.
And we see them as much as possible. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'd like to go around the room and have you introduce yourselves to me and to each other so that we can get to know each other as we study together. I'm going to start with the order appearing on my screen, which will be top left, Ron Dombrowski.
Hi, Dr. Huff. How you doing?
Great to see you.
Great. I'm here with my wife, Patty.
Hi, Patty.
Hi,
and-
Patricia from last class.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yes, it's good to see you. Yeah.
And we live in the Hudson Valley at a place called Palinville. But right now we're in North Carolina for a while in Carolina Beach. We have 2 children and 4 grandchildren. And I teach social studies, and
Mary
Patty.
Deacon.
Oh, and I was ordained a deacon in September, and Patty's an occupational therapist.
Wonderful to have you both. It's good to
Thanks.
see you both.
I'm going to use this class in school next year in
Oh,
September.
good. Okay, good.
Thank you.
And
Yeah, my pleasure. Correct me anytime. Social
No.
studies teachers are not to be messed with. I've learned a lot.
No.
I taught high school for a number of years, and you guys know your stuff. So
No, most of the stuff I don't know. That's why I'm taking the course now.
yeah, well, very good. I'm gonna go next to Jim. I think it's Jim Craig. Is that right? I'm a little at a distance from my screen, so I may have to. My eyesight is not really with this particular setup. What am I? I'm
Well,
going
You
to
can,
walk.
could you sit on that thing?
I'm gonna walk around here for this part. The drop mics are only one location. So I'm gonna go here to back off. Okay, so okay, I'm gonna go to Joe Gray.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joe Gray. I have a wife of 26 years named Celeste. We have 4 adult children who are in various stages of leaving the nest. I live in Eden, New York. I was ordained a deacon in 2019. And the purpose of study is to learn more about how the Bible fits in with archaeology, and for continuing education.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. It's great to meet you. Great to meet you. And Jamie.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jamie Fishgold. My wife works for the church. Her name's Camilla. She's worked for the church for about 15 years. And I live in Green Valley, Arizona. I'm originally from Rochester. And the purpose of this course, I was originally working towards my degree when I worked for the church, St. Catherine's in Mendon. And then when I moved to Arizona, I decided to continue my studies just because I'm interested in learning more about my faith. And this is my 4th semester in a row with Professor Hughes Huff. And that's about it.
It's true. It's good to have you back, Jamie.
Thank you.
We're going on to Regina.
Yes, I am a Jersey girl who's lived in Washington State for the past 20 years. I'm married to a commercial fisherman, and I'm recently retired nurse practitioner. And 2 years ago, I started reading a fair amount of spirituality that moved to theology, that moved to Christian history, and now has moved to the archaeology piece of it. And honestly, I've always fantasized about going on a dig. So there you have it.
There you go. I hope you'll come with us next summer. We'll see what happens. Good. Thank you. Very nice to meet you, Regina. Tom DeShipio.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tom, and I'm married to my wife, Chris. We have one son who's 22. I'm in the Buffalo Diocese. I live in a small town called Elma, which is about half hour outside the city. This is actually my last class of my master's in theology. And I've always been very interested in the spiritual side of my faith, but also the very concrete historical side. So I'm really excited about this class, and glad to be with you guys.
Great to have you again, Tom. It's great to see you. All right, and Craig.
My name's Craig O'Hara. I live in Lewiston, New York, so the Buffalo area. I've been married to my wife, Lisa, for 15 years. And we have one daughter, Isabella. She's 7, or just about to turn 7. The 2 main reasons I'm taking the course. One is I'm discerning applying, whether or not I should apply to the diaconate formation process for the Buffalo Diocese. And I teach criminology, and my specialty within that is sociology of religion and deviance and just, how religious faith comes about and develops. So to me, it's fascinating to learn more about it at the seminary level. And I've audited a course with Dr. Huff last session. I really enjoyed it, got a great deal out of it. So I'm looking forward to this course too.
Wonderful. Great to be back, Greg. We're kind of Mary.
Hi, I'm Mary. I live a little bit outside of Rochester. It's me and my fiance now and our dog. And I guess a little bit about me. I graduated from undergrad a couple of years ago after studying history and religion. And now I'm a retail reporter at Business Insider, but I thought it would just be cool to audit this class and kind of, continue learning something very different from what I'm doing during the day. So excited to learn.
Mary, it's great to have you. Congratulations. Deacon Daniel Tyler.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, my name's Deacon Dan Tyler. I am ordained since 2014. I'm married to my wonderful wife, Ellen, for 46 years Sunday. And I'm taking this course just to learn a little bit more about the archaeology of the world. And I'm glad to be with you all.
Great to have you here, Deacon Dan.
Thank you.
We'll go down to Joshua Kennedy.
Hi, I'm Joshua Kennedy. I live in Norfolk, Virginia. I'm currently studying psychology, but I've always been interested in archaeology and understanding the past and how people lived, as well as the Bible and interpreting the Bible and within the context of history.
Wonderful. Great. I'm so happy you're with us from Norfolk. Great place.
Thanks.
There about 2 years ago. Loved it. All right, Yvonne, tell us about your life. Yvonne. Oh, you're muted there, Yvonne.
You hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Ivan. I live in Buffalo. I'm taking this class because I just want to learn about the relationship between archaeology and the Catholic faith.
Wonderful. Glad you're here, Yvonne. Yvonne has already 1 degree from St. Bernard's, is working on a second, as well as a deacon ordination in Buffalo. Is that right? Yvonne?
Yep.
Yep. Good.
Thank you.
All right, Elizabeth. Elizabeth's camera isn't working, but she is here.
Hi, everyone. I apologize. The laptop that I normally use to Zoom with was giving me technical difficulties. So I had to jump on my bigger laptop, which the camera doesn't work. So it's been a wonderful year in the field of catechesis, working with little people. I've been married 16 years to my husband, Scott, and we live just north of Albany, New York in Waterville. And I've been a Catholic school teacher, and I have overseen faith formation programs. And I'm auditing this course for my upkeep in being a catechetical leader, but also I've always been interested in history and things that we can discover. So science and archaeology and the Bible just seem like a perfect way of rounding out some formation that I needed to keep up my certification. So thank you for allowing me to be part of your group. And hopefully next week I'll be on with my camera.
Okay, wonderful. That's great. It's wonderful to have you, Elizabeth. Okay, now we got 2 folks in the room. I'm going to go start first with Joe.
Hi, my name is Joseph. I'm 22. I live about 20 minutes outside of Buffalo. I just completed my criminal justice degree, my bachelor's in arts at Norwich University. My plan is to, with God willing, go to seminary next August in Baltimore. And I currently live with my grandparents and my dog, who her name is Charlie, and she is a fur missile. My interest in archaeology is that I love history. I always wanted to be a history teacher, but I knew that if I ended up having to be forced to study it, I'd probably end up hating it in the end. So I'm more of a, how would you say, like a freelancer when it comes to it. So I'm just here to enjoy the course, being in an audit, don't have to worry about a grade or anything like that, and happy to be here.
Glad to have you here, Joseph. Bill's coming in on both.
I can't see the screen, so I thought I could get in here and,
Oh, yeah.
but that's not gonna work.
Well, you might want to
Yeah.
mute your, or like turn your sound off. You just turn the sound off.
Oh, it's fine.
Okay.
Okay. So, name's Bill Broderick. I'm from Elma. I'm married with 3 kids. I don't remember all the questions, but I'm also a deacon ordained about a month ago. And taking the course because it's an area I don't know very well, and that interests me.
All right, very good. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Bill, and congratulations. So yeah, thanks.
Hi, Joe and Tom.
Good,
Hey, Bill.
good to be with you. I encourage you, if you're in the Buffalo area, I'll make my pitch. I encourage you to come join us at the Catholic Center. There's free parking. There's free coffee. There's free soda. What else is there free? I don't know. There's a bunch of stuff in the kitchen. And most importantly, there's human beings that you can interact with. If you're vaccinated, unmasked. If you're not masked, but we can all, unless you're sitting 6 feet apart, there's all kinds of. But the things are loosening up, so we can be in person, which is nice. And I'd love to have as many of you Buffalo folk in here as would like to join us. So please feel free, come down. And all of you coming in on Zoom, that's wonderful. We are at St. Bernard's. We're located both in Rochester and Albany. So we try to be physically present wherever we're teaching as much as possible. But we also always have Zoom. So, all right. It's great to meet you all. We are indeed going to talk about archaeology. We may have some more people joining us. I'm not sure. I have, by my count, 29 students in the course. I think we're missing some tonight for whatever reason. It's totally fine. But so I know there'll be more joining us at some point. But hope you enjoy talking with each other. From time to time, I'll send us off into breakout rooms. I believe in them. Usually in my course evaluations, I get 1 of 2 comments. I love the breakout sessions. They're the best. Or I hate the breakout sessions. They're a total waste of time. So people have strong opinion about the breakout rooms. So I try to use them a little bit and not the whole time. And that's what we'll do. But that's what are we going to talk about in this course? So what's the whole point? What's the method? Well, as you can see, the course description, which you've all already read, we're talking about texts in the Bible and archaeological remains from the ancient world. And we're going to study the methods archaeologists use to interpret artifacts and discuss what role the Bible has had in the framing of archaeological questions. We will discover how archaeological artifacts can enrich our understanding of the Bible and explore the role of modern politics in archaeological debates. The course will focus on a period of over 1,500 years, from the late Bronze Age through the early Roman period, and will cover such topics as stratigraphy, ceramics typology, iconography, sacred space, text materiality, and forgeries, in order to build a richer understanding of ancient Israel and early Christianity. So that's the point of the course. I sometimes try to make things very relevant, and I will be doing that. However, if you look at the syllabus, you will see that I also went a little wild in compiling the secondary research on these topics. So you can, I view this as this kind of course for me as it's just very fun, and there's a lot of research on it. But you'll also notice that the readings are not onerous, I don't think. Some weeks it's a little onerous, but not terribly onerous, and I've provided basically a bibliography for each week that only some of it would be required reading, and the rest of it will be for those of you who want to do more reading now or at a later time. So we will, of course, read and come together and talk about what we read. I encourage you, those of you who are auditing, to have a look at the readings. We are, except for the little course textbook, everything else I'll be posting on Canvas. So you should be able to access that for free, and certainly not required to read, but it's great to read to keep up with what we're talking about in the course and to be ready to discuss it. If you have a chance, I encourage you to do so. I don't distinguish between credit and audit students in terms of what I'm willing to do for you, right? So you are required to do the work, but if you decide to submit a paper or you want to talk about the reading that you did this past week, I will not recognize any distinction between credit and audit in that way. So you feel free to fully participate in the course. And if you do want to submit papers, just let me know and I'll make sure Canvas is open for you to turn those in and feedback. So the assignments that I have designed for the course are as follows. We have an object bibliography, and this is a way of thinking about how an artifact comes to live in the museum or wherever we might find it, where it came from, how it got there, what studies have been done on it, what we can know about it and how and why, kind of thing. And for that, I'll be providing a museum exhibit book that you can look through from the Met Museum to choose an object from there, or you can choose any object you'd like. That is from this time period. And I have a more detailed prompt on that. That's a 3 to 5 pager, and that is going to be an object bibliography to think about one object. We have 3 David papers, 2 short papers with the prompts about the David and Solomon of the Bible in comparison with the archaeological evidence. And then 1 third paper bringing all the 2 short papers together and making some conclusions. So those are sort of 3 guided papers, none of which are very long. And the third of which is a combination of the first 2. Then we'll have a Lachish paper. This is an opportunity for you to look at a site report of an archaeological dig and sort out what a site report looks like. What does an archaeologist do when they come back from a dig? You know, they write a site report, they show photos, they draw up a plan, they make their conclusions. And so that paper will be another 3 to 5 page paper where you'll report on the Lachish site report. So you will come away from the course having an understanding of how to look at an archaeological dig and know what to make of it. And then reading discussion. So we're not going to do quizzes and tests for this. And we are going to do papers. And we're not going to do a big final paper. So that's how I've designed it. Any questions on the assignments?
Just a quick question on the reading.
Yeah.
Is the date of the reading, is it like today's readings? Was that due today or was that assigned today?
That's due today. And that, of course, will immediately be given an extension for the first book for as long as you need, because I only posted the syllabus to the vicissitudes of my own last couple of weeks yesterday. So that is not enough time for you to have read the required reading for today, which is the first introductory textbook. You can pick that up and read it. It's very short. I read it in like 2 sittings. You can read that. What's that? 168 pages. Very, very easy to get through. We will talk about it a little bit more next week. I actually purposefully laid off of our discussion of that this week because I didn't give you enough time. But read that over the next couple of weeks along with the required readings, if you would.
Thank you.
And that's a very fun, easy read. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. We're going to focus on the broad historical setting that we're dealing with. So what's happening in the broader world, the archaeological data that tells us about that historical setting, and the Bible and other texts. That's going to be our focus. So today you're going to see I'm going to give you a very broad historical setting. And part of that is, so we want to talk about the Bible and archaeological evidence and how they work together. But one thing that is extremely important for that is to get the sense of the vastness of what's happening in the ancient world, right? So I think sometimes arguments become very focused on the very particular questions of ancient Israelite history that can sometimes even sort of click into place when you just take a step back and say, like, here's 3,000 years of history and archaeology that lead up to this moment. And here's how this all comes together. And here's the setting, here's what Israel's doing, here's what kind of player Israel is in the broad historical political scene. And that sort of breadth helps us to see the particular thing we're going to look at with Israel and Judah in its right context. So we're always going to start with this broad historical setting. What's happening? We're going to talk about David and Solomon, the extent of David's kingdom, what kind of archaeological sites show the extent of David's kingdom in the 9th century, in the 10th century. What are we also going to be looking at? What's Assyria doing? What's Egypt doing? What's Aramea doing? What's up with the rest of the world at that point? Because they don't exist in a vacuum. And all these things are real. Sometimes we, even in a history class, forget, and this is really important, that all this stuff was really happening, right? So it's not merely stories, it's real. So we're always going to keep the broad historical setting. We're going to look at the archaeological data, both for, arguments like, okay, here's a site with these kinds of buildings, and here's why this archaeologist thinks it's from this century and supports this interpretation of the Bible. And here's why this other archaeologist thinks it comes from the next century and supports another interpretation of the Bible. So we're going to look at that kind of archaeological data. But we also look at, like, okay, so if you were an 8th century Israelite, what did you eat your breakfast in? How did writing work? Did you write letters to your mom, or was that not a part of your life because you weren't, was it just scribes who could write? What did a temple look like, and how did people worship in it? So this kind of everyday thing that may not be so much about an argument, so much as bringing the true, concrete, colorful, beautiful, real existence of ancient Israelites to our consciousness via real physical objects. And then we're also going to be looking at the Bible, of course, to see where are these things described in the Bible? How does the Bible match accounts of similar historical events or the same historical event from other texts? If an Assyrian text describes an event and the Bible describes an event, we'll compare those and we'll look at the archaeological data in comparison to that. And we'll see what is the Bible saying historically, and how can that help us understand what's happening with the archaeology. Are any questions about any of that sort of broad method? Great. All right, so Israel, in the broadest sense, of course, is part of the globe and all of humankind, but I didn't go back that far. We didn't talk about, we're not going to cover like Chalcolithic archaeology in this class and talk about skulls or anything, but we are going to talk about the ancient Middle East, which is often also often called the ancient Near East. And that is the broad, at the broadest level, what ancient Israel and Judah are a part of. Now, what is that? What is the ancient Middle East? The ancient Middle East is a region roughly equivalent to the modern Middle East. And in this region dwelled several early civilizations. Mesopotamia, which is covers modern Iraq, southeast Turkey, southwest Iran, northeastern Syria, and Kuwait. So not just Iraq, but this whole region. Ancient Egypt, which covers about the same political boundaries as modern Egypt, maybe a little bit further into the south, depending on how big the dominion got. Ancient Iran, the kingdoms of Elam, Media, Parthia, and Persia were part of that. And then Anatolian Asia Minor and the Armenian Highlands, where we find the Mitanni, the Hittites, the Hurrians, and other folk. And then the Levant, which is modern Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan. And the polities there are many, but including ancient Israel. And then Cyprus and the Arabian Peninsula. That's the region. Those are the folks that live there. Those are the players in this history. When we think about the history of the ancient Middle East, we are usually talking about the rise of Sumer in the 4th millennium, where you start to get things that are recordable as history. You start to get the very earliest writing and some sort of descriptions of what's happening, where you can start to talk about history. Before that, we tend to talk about anthropology, but that's debated how you define history. But for our purposes, we're going to talk about the history of the ancient Middle East as the rise of the Sumerians in the 4th millennium BC. And the Sumars are part of ancient Mesopotamia, and they are the ones who start that whole show. The term covers then the Bronze Age and the Iron Age in the region until a conquest ended the ancient Middle East. Either the Achaemenid conquest in the 6th century BC, Persia, the Macedonian conquest in the 4th century BC, that's Alexander the Great, or the Muslim conquests in the 7th century AD. So that's how people talk about it. All right, so what's meant by ancient in the ancient Near East, ancient Middle East. Okay, so that's our broadest region. Here's a map of it for your pleasure, where we have Mesopotamia coming through the middle of the Tigris and Euphrates, Elam down there in the region of Iran, the Mitanni and the Hittites up in Anatolia, Ashur up in the Ashur could sometimes extend further to the west as well. Harzawa, Crete and Cyprus, and Egypt in the lower left, and Canaan, where if you were to zoom way out on this map, you can see the small polities in Canaan, which would include Israel and Judah, along with some others. So this is our region of the ancient Middle East, and the folks that were roaming about in it and doing stuff that we can talk about and look at, leaving behind remains and so on. So let's start with looking at Mesopotamia quickly. I'm not going to give us like much of a history. We could have a whole, class on each one of these things, of course, but I'm just going to talk about each of them with a broad overview. So Mesopotamia was an ancient region located in the eastern Mediterranean, bounded in the northeast by the Zagros Mountains and southeast by the Arabian Plateau, corresponding to Iraq, Iran, Syria, Turkey. It's also known as the Fertile Crescent cradle civilization. As you will remember from 7th grade? So the Zagros Mountains are here, and then the Arabian Plateau down here. This is where you stop wanting to have the desert. Yeah, you don't want to spend much time over here. The true desert. So this Fertile Crescent right up in here, this is your Mesopotamian civilization. And this map shows us that it often extended all the way into this region. It could, during times of state competition, Mesopotamia was certainly competing for cities in Syria with the Hittites in the north and the Egyptian folk down here in the southwest. these would be sort of contested cities. That's Mesopotamia. The history of Mesopotamia, like I said, starts in the 4th millennium with Sumer, where you get the beginning of cities. You then move to what we call the early dynastic. The Akkadian Empire follows that, the 3rd dynasty of Ur, in the Old Babylonian period, from which we get tons of texts, including things like the Gilgamesh epic. And you have some old Assyrian colonies, which are, so Assyria starts to be a sort of competing power in the north, and they start to build a colony toward the west. And so you get the extension of Mesopotamian influence over to the west during the Old Babylonian period. And then you start talking about the Late Bronze Age, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which then gets taken over by the Persians during the Achaemenid Empire. So this is your broadest overview possible of this. And I only point this up because I'm not even going to talk about each of these periods, but we're only going to cover the last 3, right? So we're going to talk about where history interacts with the Bible. The Israelite narrative really starts coming in where you could even talk about archaeology at the very end of the Late Bronze Age. So you've got just a small portion of this ancient Eastern history overlaps with Israel and Judah. Do we have a hand raised? Okay, who is it?
Yes.
Yeah, Ron, go for it.
I'm just curious. Yeah, I've got like 2,334. You've got 95. You've got 612. Those look pretty precise, more precise than I would have thought. Any comments?
Yeah, I would have to go, and I took these from a text on that divided this up this way. And
Okay.
I think there's like specific things they have in mind where one king, like so for the switch from the Neo-Assyrian to the Neo-Babylonian Empire, that's a conquest, right? This is a king taking over Babylon, Syria rather, and taking over and ruling these empires. So there are precise dates for that.
Okay.
The Late Bronze Age, yeah, that's what marks the end of that is going to be debatable. The people debate those dates. Yeah. And I left out this early Iron Age for some reason. So I was hoping you would notice that, but that's true. For some reason,
in the middle?
yeah, I left out for whatever reason what was happening between Late Bronze and the Assyrian Empire during the Iron Age. But so I'll have to fix that back. But yeah, so we have various. Sometimes there are definite instances of collapse. And the Late Bronze Age is another one where the end of the Late Bronze Age is a very dateable thing because the entire system that was set up, which was a massive diplomatic, economic system, cooperation of major states, collapsed. And it was a huge shift of everything from the Late Bronze Age to the Iron Age, which is what we're actually going to talk about next week. So Late Bronze Age collapse is a fascinating thing, but it's a little more dateable. Yeah.
So you have, a lot of texts in the Bible are actually writings memorializing things from farther back, significantly farther back.
Yeah.
What book is the oldest book that fits back into this?
So setting aside for so the antediluvian, what we call the antediluvian period, where you've got the figures who come before the flood. So from Genesis 1 through 11, we've got creation story all the way up to the flood. We don't typically try to date that stuff, right? That's just like impossible, right? The earliest thing that people really try to deal with is Abraham.
Okay,
Yeah.
I was actually more thinking of the historical text as opposed to.
Yeah, no, yeah. Well, I mean, hey.
I was actually trying to fit where you had the, the historical text, because those are more historical texts.
Yeah, yeah.
And
So
where those are fitting and what would be the sort of the starting and
yeah, so
just a sort of a frame of reference.
yeah, frame of reference is the earliest thing that we can say, okay, here's archaeological evidence and here's the Bible, is the Israel emerging in the highlands in the 10th century. So that's the early Iron Age, where Israel is coming, and we have texts and judges that portray, some sort of loose tribal confederation, and that we have maybe a portrayal of a caravan route in Judges 5, and then we have archaeological evidence of increasing settlement up in the highlands of Canaan. So that's our first, like, archaeology meets the Bible. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, because I do remember I was in Iraq, and I was stationed at Nazareth at the air base outside, which is where they say is the birthplace of Abraham.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's actually a site there, a site that's been excavated that has some of the residences.
Yeah,
that were there, and there were actually pieces of pottery and stuff all over that.
Absolutely.
So that would be.
Yes, if we want to say, okay, Abram's from Ur, and then here's Ur, we could definitely talk about that. Yeah, for sure.
But is there like a big gap between that and what you're talking about in terms of
not so much. We can talk about, like, okay, here's where Abraham's from, like here's Ur, and then let's dig up Ur, and then this is what Abraham's home might have looked like. Here's where he traveled. Here's his itinerary. We can go to all those sites. We could talk about Egypt, New Kingdom Egypt, when Israel might have been in captivity there, and we could learn about what Israel, what the biblical narrative. If the biblical narrative is accurate, then we could learn about, like, what Abraham would have been looking at and what his life might have been like. Same thing for Israel and Egypt, but we don't have any way to say, oh, here's a site that Abraham made, right? Like,
oh, right, they're transient.
Yeah, they're
taking
transient.
everything with them when they
Yeah,
stop.
exactly. So we can't sort of like find a site and identify it with Abraham anyway. Whereas we can do that with settlements in the early Israelite highlands. Yeah.
So really, that's right. That's the first part at which you can sort of make the direct connection.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Can the students on Zoom hear Bill's question? Yep. Is that good? Okay, good. Yeah, good. Just making sure.
I'm usually through that.
Yeah, no, yeah. I'm just not
louder,
used to this
yeah.
classroom, so I'm not sure. Those drop mics are making me nervous. All right, so Hatti, this is the region of Hittite Empire, another major player leading up to Israel. And the Hittite kingdom was founded in the earlier middle years of the 17th century, and its capital was established at Hattusha, located 150 kilometers east of Ankara. The kingdom lasted some 5 centuries throughout the period known as the Late Bronze Age. And it sadly came to an end at the end of the Late Bronze Age as an empire in any case. So here's the Hittite Empire, where you see, in modern day Turkey extended down to modern day Syria and into the Levant. They were also controlled a lot of the Levant in terms of sort of empire and trade and demands for, tribute and that kind of thing. And it's a glorious empire, major player, just as important at this certain Bronze Age as Egypt and Mesopotamia. Not known, however, to history outside very much outside the text of the Bible until discoveries in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. So the Hatti, we have early period, Old Kingdom, New Kingdom, fall of the Hittites. Fall of the Hittites is a long period, but it is a long fall. And we've got a whole sequence of kings that go through here, and they are major players with Egypt. There's lots of battles between the Hittites and the Egyptians, and various back and forths and marriages and so on. So they are an important polity, and there they are, late Bronze Age Hatti. I want to take a minute to talk a little bit more about the Hittites than I did about the Mesopotamians, because they are interesting and actually somewhat influential for the Bible. When it comes to examining, say, the ritual text of the Bible, like say, for instance, Leviticus 16, where we have the scapegoat, right, where the sons of Israel are loaded up on a goat and driven out into the wilderness for this Azazel. Such rites are quite common in Hatti, and after the fall of the Hittite Empire, some of these Hittites came south, intermarried with Arameans, and formed sort of northern Syrian, southern Syrian cultures and city-states with where they developed sort of a Northwest Semitic language, and their culture becomes similar to stuff we find in the Bible. And we've got Hittites in the Bible, like Uriah the Hittite, who worked with David, who was Bathsheba's first husband, and he was not someone from the Hittite Empire that we're going to talk about, but one of these what we call Neo-Hittite, later Aramean Hittite blend kind of polities. So there's definite influence on the Bible from this culture that developed out of the Hittites eventually. And it's a fun place where we've got, let me just say, okay, the Hittite language is an Indo-European language, like Latin, German, and English. Greek, Latin, German, English. It works similarly to Greek and Latin with its case system. And it is the only Indo-European language written in cuneiform. So, Mesopotamians don't use an alphabet, they use a cuneiform sign system to write Akkadian. And Akkadian is an East Semitic language, similar to Arabic and Hebrew and other Semitic languages. The Hittites said, this is a cool system, and used this cuneiform design to write as Semitic languages in, and then adapted it to write their Indo-European language. That makes it a weird language to read, but it's really fun. And this uncovering of Hattusha, the capital city of Hatti, happened in about 1878 by the Germans, and that dig has gone on since that time. So the national German folks have, archaeological folks have been working on this site and all of Hatti since then, with, of course, increasing cooperation with Turkey all the while. Yes.
So with the Hittite language, is it sort of like how the Japanese took Chinese characters and incorporated it into their own language, like kanji?
Yes. Yes and no. So that is more like a Sumerogram, which is happening when Akkadian takes a Sumerogram, which is just a sign, a wedge, like a total sign that means a word, whereas Akkadian is written out in syllables, right? And Hatti adapts both. So it pulls in the writing system. So they're just using the writing system, but it's just like they're using the writing system to represent Hittite symbols, but they're also using a ton of Sumerograms and sometimes Akkadograms in the way that you're describing that the Japanese or the Chinese. So sometimes they'll take one one cuneiform sign and mean a word with it. Sometimes they'll take a cuneiform sign and mean a syllable with it. So, so it's a crazy thing to read for those reasons, exactly. And uncovering Hattusha, so here's where they were starting this dig, and this is one of the tells. This is a temple that they've uncovered with some altars in it. This is the sort of what an archaeological find looks like. It's not as exciting as we would like sometimes, but it's actually extremely exciting once you can interpret it. But here we have like the foundations, the walls, and some altars that show us that this is one of the temples at Hattusha. While digging through there, they found massive troves of Hittite tablets, which is a beautiful thing when that happens. Sometimes you can go, excavate all kinds of cities and learn a lot. But when you actually find a trove of tablets, then you can really start to study the group of people. And this happened in the 20th century at Hatti, and the deciphering of the Hittite language happened, and we have just tablet after tablet of Hittite to study. And it's a glorious, wonderful thing. This is a really cool piece. This is a tablet made out of bronze. Most tablets are made out of clay, and you use a stylus to form the cuneiform signs within the clay. This one is inscribed into bronze and then hung up on these with these chains. So a lot of these cuneiform tablets, especially of great size like this, whatever they're made of, were intended to be monuments of treaties and agreements. So you're not going to forget this. This really brings that point home, where they're going to chain this thing to so that no one can forget what's been done. This is a state treaty of Tuathalis IV, made about 1260 to 1240 BC. It's found at Bagashkoy, which is the Turkish name for the site of Hattusha, in 1986. In this tablet, Hattusili III, sorry, after how did I write this? Oh, it's right. So he talks about his dad, Hattusili III. He notes that his dad deposed Uriteship, the son of his son, his brother, right, and absolved his second son of fruits of any blame and permits him to maintain his position as king in the southern land of Taruntasha. So this is an issue of proper. I lost the word for passing on the kingly rights, investiture of kingship and kingly realms. And so it's a state treaty.
So this is like knowing how the authority.
Yeah.
For the treaty.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
While they were excavating, how deep would have this been in the ground that they were digging?
I don't know for sure on the bronze tablet how deep it was. I would say probably fairly deep, because this is these tells at Hutwell. There was a village, but because this was destroyed and wasn't rebuilt, the tell of Hattusha could actually be, this could have been nearer the surface than if it had continued to be rebuilt over the centuries.
Okay, thank you.
It's actually amazing that it's actually survived, because you would think people would have grabbed something like that and melted down or something.
Yeah, this is
something useful.
It seems like they were bringing a bunch of stuff together in the city to preserve it and hiding it from the oncoming sea peoples, and that there are these tablets that are all just huge collections, maybe being hidden, and then the city was destroyed and they just sat there until
Like the Dead Sea Scrolls.
3,000 years later, whatever. So yeah. Yeah, Dead Sea Scrolls, same situation with Dead Sea Scrolls. Yeah. Here's the bronze tablet as a physical object in a museum. Here is a hand drawing of the bronze tablet. So a cuneiform scholar will not just sit with a bronze tablet and a cigar and read it aloud to you normally. Some can, really good ones can, but most of them will make a hand copy. So what gets published for other people to read and comment upon and do work on is a hand drawing of the tablet. So the cuneiform signs become a bit more clear for the modern eye. They will use a little magnifying glass in their eye to make sure they're getting exactly the right sign. And there's a methodology of making the hand drawing. And that is what the hand drawing will look like and what you would then put into a transliteration. So if you're going to read Hittite, you would start with this in front of you. So if I study it, when I read Hittite, I would not read this. I'm not good at it, enough good at it to read that. A true Hittitologist with a method of hand drawing would make the hand drawing. I know enough Hittite to read that, and I would slowly work through it to write out what each of those cuneiform signs are, and it would end up looking like this, where you have it put into English from the put into Latin letters from the cuneiform signs, what each cuneiform sign is representing. So you see each cuneiform sign represents a syllable, except for those that are, this is a catagram, ana, which is the, like you were talking about, this is an acadagram, which just is the Akkadian word actually for two, it's preposition two. Then mur is the Sumerigram for like prince or ruler, so that's actually Sumerian. So when you read any Hittite text, you've got to know a little bit of Akkadian and a little bit of Sumerian and then all of Hittite in order to get through it. So that's what you would end up there, and then you put it into a translation. And that, when my father Hattushili revolted against Urateshep, son of Muatili, and deposed him from kingship, no blame whatsoever attached to or remained with Kurantas. However, people of Hatti had been at fault. Kurantas was in no way whatsoever involved in the wrong side. Already before the king Muatilis had given him, that is Kurantas, to Hattushili to raise, and already before my father, that is Hattushili, had raised him. Previously, Muatilis, the king, had handed him over to my father Hattushilis to raise, and my father had raised him. So very clear as to what we're talking about. Some repetition. This is characteristic of these types of agreements. So
now, there were gaps in the thing there.
Yeah.
You couldn't read.
Yeah.
So are people
some of those will be
filling those in? with
Yeah.
What they fits with the rest of the.
Yep.
line.
What's the gap, and then what word would go there, and then you just put that in brackets. Yeah. And a great deal of ink is sometimes spilled as to what should be properly constructed. Okay, so that's just to give you sort of in the vibe of the Hittites. The Hittites were involved with a very, very important find in Egypt, another trove of cuneiform tablets called the Amarna letters. And here on the screen, you see some examples of the Amarna letters. These are small clay tablets like this, written primarily in Akkadian. And they were letters going back and forth between the major powers of the day, Egypt and Hatti and Babylon and Assyria, and then back and forth to some of the vassals of Egypt. You know, this would be in Syria and Canaan, cities that were their vassals who owed them tribute and who sometimes would defect to Babylon or Hatti, so they had to sort of sort that out. So these letters are interesting because they're primarily letters that Egypt received, but Egypt also kept copies of letters that they wrote back. So we have both. And this was a grand age, the late Bronze Age is what these come from, a grand age of diplomacy and letter writing and trade. And you said, I sent you these spices and so on, and you didn't send me a princess like you promised. And you sent me this or that, you know, so these kings sort of going back and forth with each other on what they wanted from each other. And it was largely symbolic as well as practical. So the Amarna letters, they're big, we'll return to them, but they were discovered in Amarna, which is in Upper Egypt in 1887. They're dated to the 14th century BCE, and they are one of the earliest examples of international diplomacy. So I'm actually gonna skip over the Zananza affair because we're running short on a little bit short on time. So I will maybe return to that. Let me give you, no, this is too interesting. I changed my mind. I'm gonna go through it really quickly. Okay, so Shupilululiuma, he is the king who extends the Hittite Empire the furthest. He is sort of a vicious warrior, and he wanted to, so what did he do? He worked in marriage diplomacy magic to tame Arzawa. He married a Zawa princess. He defeated Mitanni in battle, and he took advantage of chaos in Egypt when Akhenaten was trying to shut down polytheism in Egypt and make everyone worship only the sun, and doing a bunch of destruction of gods and so on. Shupilululiuma said, okay, you guys are having your own problems. I'm gonna go take over some of these states that you are in control of, including Ugarit, which was a hugely important port city that we'll return to. So a widow then of Egypt, a widow of a king in Egypt, called in Hittite Dakamuntu, writes him a letter. This is likely either Nefertiti, who is Akhenaten's widow, or Meritaten, his daughter, or I'm going to mispronounce this. Ankesenam. Do I have another extra E in there? Ankesenamen. That's King Tut's widow. Okay, so that's we don't know for sure who it is, but it's an important Egyptian widow. She writes Shupilululiuma asking for a prince to marry. Okay. My husband died, she says. This is part of an Amarna letter. A son I have not, but to thee they say, the sons are many. If you would give me one of the son of thine, he would become my husband. Never shall I pick out a servant of mine and make him my husband. I am afraid. So she's probably trying to solidify power here. She is currently ruling Egypt. She is afraid that she'll be deposed. There were some female pharaohs in Egyptian history, but it wasn't common. And so she wants to solidify power. Shupilululiuma says, I don't know. Such a thing has never happened to me in my whole life, he writes. He then sends a diplomat to make sure it's not deception. Okay, so he doesn't say, yes, I'll send your prince, he sends a diplomat. And then this upsets the queen, who says, why do you say they deceived me in that way? Had I a son, would I have written about my own and my own country's shame to a foreign land? You didn't believe me and spoke like this to me. Who is my husband has died. I do not have a son. Never shall I take a servant of mine and make him my husband. I have written to no other country, only to you have I written. They say thy sons are many, so give me one son of thine. To me he will be a husband, but to Egypt he will be a king. So this is, we know this from modern Europe in some ways too. The queen here does not want to take one of her servants that's any other Egyptian. It would upset the whole ideology of Egypt, where the pharaoh and the pharaoh's wife are practically gods, right? So that all the citizens are subjects or servants. It would upset them to do that. What's that? Yeah, exactly. Can't do it. But to get a royal from another country is fine, right? That's a parallel move. So Shupilululiuma is still concerned. He says, you keep asking me for a son of mine. If it were my duty, he will in some way become hostage, but king you will not make him. Finally, he relents and sends a son, Zananza, but he's murdered on the way to Egypt. No. Shupilululiuma is incensed and again attacks Amku, where his grandson Muwatalli would later fight the Kaddish, and he brings back many Egyptian prisoners. So this goes off the rails. Now, seems that he was murdered probably by someone who didn't want the queen to continue her deal, not by the queen herself. She seems to have been sincere. But it doesn't matter because such as, Chukwuluma knew that it would happen, and it happened. Son is murdered. But what then happens, Mershili II has to take over from his dad, Chukwuluma. And the problem with those Egyptian prisoners that he brought back in triumph, they had the plague, right? So the widow gets her revenge. She comes back, she sends back these prisoners with the plague. And guess what? Hatti has the plague for like 100 years. It's a huge problem. They're dying in droves. Mershili takes over and just everyone is dying. They're all the Hatti is dying. This becomes the beginning of Hatti's decline because they just cannot get rid of the plague, which was given to them by the Egyptians.
So there must be disconnect between the way people are dating the rulers in both countries, such that they can't decide at which stage they're parallel. So that's why you can't tell whether it's Tut's widow or Nefertiti.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Because they can keep the lines themselves in order. They can't join them in.
That's very insightful, Bill. That's very insightful. We have what's that?
That's why we can thank the Roman Empire for a centralized calendar.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's extremely insightful. I didn't want to go into that exactly because it's confusing, but in a succinct comment, have identified the problem. We have clear relative dating and we have clear lines of pharaohs in Egypt, but a lot of debate about how Egyptian history maps on to other polities. And it's like at that point in the late Bronze Age, it's fairly, it's only within a couple of kings, but sometimes you can get even further afield. So, yeah. So Mershili went around the country praying to all of the gods that the Hittites worshipped. They were known even in the ancient world as the land of 1,000 gods, because whenever they encountered someone, they just adapted their gods. And he went around the country praying to all of them. And he wrote them all in text. We have all of these texts. We have a huge series of texts and a bunch of other texts. They're all prayers that Mershili offered to gods to try to get rid of the plague. It's actually quite sad in a way to read through all these things because he's desperate. He's praying. Here's one. He says, "O storm god of Hatti, my lord, and the gods of Hatti, my lords, Mershili, your servant, has sent me, saying, go and speak to the storm god of Hatti and to the gods, my lords, as follows. What is it you have done? You have let loose the plague in the interior land of Hatti, and the land of Hatti has been sorely, greatly oppressed by the plague. Under my father and under my brother, there was constant dying. And since I became priest of the gods, there is no constant dying under me. Behold, it is 20 years since people have been continually dying in the heart of Hatti. Will the plague never be eliminated from the land of Hatti? I cannot overcome the worry from my heart. I cannot overcome the anguish from my soul." So this is the kind of lament that we find in the Bible, in something like Lamentations or some of the lament psalms. We can see this kind of expression of lament from Mershili here in a lot of his texts due to the plague. And yeah, it stayed around for a long time after this too. All right, so that's the ancient Hittite Empire, just a little window into it. So I think it's less known, and it's very interesting and quite relevant. So then we come to ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt was a civilization of ancient North Africa, concentrated along the lower reaches of the Nile River, situated in a place that is now the country of Egypt. And that ancient Egypt is, here's the extent along the Nile. And it is one of the most studied and beloved histories, and quite fascinating with its own unique style of art, burial, and focus on the afterlife in a way that was unique in its time in its period, or in its area, and a rich history both internally and externally. One of the most powerful civilizations, and it was conquered only finally by the Greeks. Never did Egypt cede to a foreign empire, right? So before the Greeks, there was one period where some Semites, some Amorites came in and managed to take over ruling Egypt, became a dynasty of Egypt. So that was kind of a conquering, but they did this by taking over the ruling class, not by sort of a complete military defeat. And they weren't an empire. That's its own sort of a thing. But anyway, that's those are called the Hyksos in Egyptian history. But they were a major important civilization and extremely important for Iron Age Israel because of the prestige culture that they encountered from Egypt. People fled to Egypt after the fall of Jerusalem. They made deals with Egypt even before that to try to push back Assyria and so on. They're a major player in Egyptian Iron Age history, Israelite Iron Age history. Even beyond the fact of the Bible's story of Israel living in Egypt during the sort of monarchical period of ancient Israel, Egypt was a major player and very influential on Israel. So again, here's our map of the ancient world. Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Hittites and Anatolia are the ones we are covering right now. In terms of major players, major civilizations, major empires. Yeah, so here's your layout of the whole history of Egypt. Forgot that was coming up. Here's the Sphinx as it's being excavated, which is cool.
You don't see your toolbar.
Oh, I know. I was just trying to get us to be able to read this. And so we start in the prehistory, then Archaic period, Old Kingdom, and these are dated based on dynasties and things that were happening. First intermediate period, Middle Kingdom, Second intermediate period, New Kingdom, Third intermediate period, Late period, and Ptolemaic period and Roman period. Egypt's still relevant for us when we get into the New Testament as well. So what's the ancient Levant? This is the last region we'll talk about. The Levant is the area where Israel and Judah are. This is the area that we're going to be focusing on. We're not doing archaeology of Egypt or Mesopotamia. We're doing archaeology of the Levant. And a subset of that archaeology of Levant is biblical archaeology or archaeology of the Bible. The Levant is a large area in Southwest Asia, south of the Taurus Mountains, bounded by the Mediterranean in the west, the Arabian Desert in the south, and Mesopotamia in the east. It stretches 400 miles north to south from the Taurus Mountains to the Sinai Desert, and 70 to 100 miles east to west between the sea and the Arabian Desert. There's a Phoenician bowl, the hunting scene, 8th century BCE. And important polities of the Levant include the following. One of the oldest polities in the Levant is Ebla, which is northwest Syria, and it runs from 3500 BC to 1600 BC. Khatna was a long-standing city-state, also in Syria, 2800 BC to 533 BC. We have some text from Ebla, not so much from Khatna, and a lot of text from Mari. Mari was an Assyrian polity which was in eastern Syria. Eastern Syria, so the very westmost part of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, I shouldn't say Neo-Assyrian, but the Assyrian, the early Assyrian colonies, and then all the way through the Middle Bronze Age. And Mari has a trove of texts, the Mari letters, which are very important. And we talk about most of that is in Akkadian, the language of Mesopotamia, but it has the kings of Mari have West Semitic names instead of East Semitic names like the Mesopotamians. And they have a lot of West Semiticisms, the words they use that are similar to stuff you find in Hebrew and Phoenician and Aramaic that aren't in Akkadian. So you then have the Amorites, which are a group of West Semitic speaking folk who show up in texts in 2500 BC, and they are a group of people that seem to be somewhat roaming, right? They didn't have like one city they were coming from, but they seemed to sort of go around. And they swept through Babylon at through Mesopotamia at one point. And also, it seems very, very likely that they were the origins of the Hyksos, who took over Egypt as well. So they were kind of a tribal group, if you will. I try not to use the word tribal because there's a lot of connotations. But anyway, they're like not a settled city group, but more of a pastoral group that ended up going into major areas with major civilizations and taking over for a period until they were overthrown in both cases. The Egyptians eventually kicked them out of Egypt. Mesopotamians eventually kicked them out of Mesopotamia. But the Amorites helped found Babylon. So they're extremely important in that respect. So the whole relationship with the Amorites and the Mesopotamia is extremely important and complex. And they are major players there. And they are part of the Levant, and their origin comes from Levant. Yamhad was the extremely powerful dynasty city-state from 1810 to 1517, the most important city in the region. It was eventually defeated by the Hittites. And that was a major event that left a power vacuum in the area. It wasn't just like a big city, it was a major player, the Yamhad. And Ugarit is a beloved city to me in current Ras Shamra, Western Syria. It's a port city, and we'll be looking at that more carefully. They discovered that in the 20th century. The archaeologists dug that up. My advisor for my grad school is the chief epigraphist for this site. So he's devoted his career to hand drawing out all of the Ugaritic tablets that were discovered there, because there's a huge trove of tablets discovered there too. And to then translating them and commenting upon them. Actually, I shouldn't say probably, he definitely is the foremost living expert in Ugaritic in the world today, and beloved by me. So Ugarit is an important port city. They would go back and forth between being allied with Egypt and being allied with the Hittites. And they wrote in West Semitic. They adapted the cuneiform writing system to become an alphabet, and are arguably the oldest alphabet in the world. And so they are, script is written in a cuneiform alphabet. Their texts are written in cuneiform alphabet, and they tell stories about a storm god called Baal, and a mountain god called El. And you know both those things in the Bible, so they're quite similar in culture and perspective to people that were encountered in the Bible. Carchemish is another Syrian, North Syrian city, very important. Phoenicia came along later after the collapse of the late Bronze Age, when Ugarit was destroyed. Ugarit was destroyed along with Hatti in the collapse of the late Bronze Age. Phoenicia, Tyre, and Sidon, they took up that role of trade from Egypt being on the port and bringing that to Mesopotamia and so on. So they were a central place of port, and they used both Egyptian and Mesopotamian motifs in their art and created sort of prestige art that Israel drew upon. So when Solomon wants to build his palace and his temple, he goes to Tyre and Sidon to get the cedars and to get the craftsmen, because that's what the Phoenicians are known about. Aramea is a polity where we get the Aramaic language, and they have a bunch of city-states to the northeast of Israel. And you'll note I didn't really give a cutoff date. There are modern day Syriac speakers who consider themselves Arameans, so we can't totally say that they've ever disappeared. And Israel and Judah, as a polity, they existed from 1000 BC to the 1st century AD. Resurrected then in 1948. As we know. All right, I've talked a lot. I think we need to take a break and come back in about, let's come back at 7:35 and we'll continue. Any, before I totally shut you off, any questions about anything we just said so far? Kind of a bird's eye view of the history leading up to the region. I hope that wasn't too boring. And we will plunge into some archaeology and the history of it at 7:35. Yes. Go for it. Oh yeah, just yeah, we gotta leave back in. That's all.
Or do you want me to just prop the door open?
Oh, you can prop it open. Yeah, that's fine.
Good Norwich. There is this one building called the U building, and it cut off half the campus by the other campus, and they would just lock it on the weekends.
Oh,
So you
yeah.
have to walk almost all the way around campus to get anywhere. So someone would always go through one window, open the door, and you would just get moved there.
That's good. How's things? You fully placed?
Yeah, I'm at my home parish and which is detention, shelter, kind of all around.
Yeah, that's the place. Yeah. Stuff. Ooh, this is a nice space.
Yeah.
I'm pleased to see it finally. Chicken Tim showed me the sound studio. It's pretty awesome.
Oh, yeah, they just, I think they just repurposed that. They've been back there since.
Oh yeah, it's real nice. Even
Yeah, I didn't think about that. I should probably look and see what they have. Flowers. Yeah.
we need to get a outlet a bigger.
Yeah, 29 minutes, we should probably plug in for the break.
Yep.
Wow.
Check. See some slides here. Try to look at talking about.
There we go.
Did it work?
Careful, the second door locks as well, so I got stopped.
Oh, how'd you get in?
One of the maintenance guys, but I got trapped in there with like 3 wasps. Like Nicolas Cage going, the beast. Oh. Forgot my phone, but didn't know what time it was. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I'm pretty good right now. I just keep getting people. I had dinner with some like BMW, but
I did this one time, just when we had this, we were interviewing, I had listened to the questions. We took this candidate to dinner, and they had this ride. Second. Sure. But it was fun. It's fine.
yeah.
Great coffee. You're fine. Oh yeah, it's true. I'm gonna drive you to the city. Sure enough. So close to what to do it. So close to it. Yeah. I wrote it up. Fine while you're talking. But I'm a very visual. Yeah, I'm very visual. Yeah. That's why I like. Yeah. See how. Like the meeting here. Right. Right, one of the problems is that, I mean, you look at all the information, and you're gonna go back later on, figure out how that relates to something I'm talking about. I don't have that there. I'm gonna help you. I like the cars, actually. Yeah. Yeah. I actually had a. Oh, yeah.
mean, a lot. People are missing information that are also might not know. Yeah, start giving them that. Then they take another one. That's really important. Yeah, like I can read a book. Yeah, but if I'm trying to put it together, I need somebody who already has it.
Great way of putting it. I love it. That's really good. Yeah. I was gonna guess that you're a big history buff, but are you a big history buff?
Yeah, that was my undergrad major.
You want to see a big history meet?
What?
A big history meet? These bears think you really want to jury. About the Battle of the Long Bridges. When bears were really got three regions in Germany. Here in Germany is uprising.
Very weak in that area.
It's from,
It was some.
it was a meme adopted from the new show Invincible. Amazon.
Oh.
Yeah, one of the, yeah, the main villain goes, think Mark, think, while he's standing over his corpse. I've read the history about when he made this for Rome, and I just started laughing. No, I'm good. I'm trying to stay away from them. As I drink a Dr. Pepper.
Really what's up. Never find those in
They're usually the first to go.
that.
They're usually the first to go.
Yeah, I know. That's why I said that's something I'm likely to find. Yeah.
Keep the rainbow one. They're very colorful.
There you go.
I got another one. They're very colorful. Oh, you got me extra cheddar. Good taste.
Okay.
Good taste, yeah. See, you are.
Don't know the difference.
Neither do I.
I feed them to my bird.
Really?
My daughter loves them. When she leaves the bag open, she doesn't want them anymore. I use them to feed the bird. The bird loves them.
Is there better than veggie MREs?
Veggie MREs.
Yeah, those things make you cute. Oh, the cold weather ones are pretty decent.
If I remember correctly, though, the first ones that came out were definitely better than the meat meal.
Did you see that they made pizza? They have a pizza MRE now.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, and it's shelf stable for 25 years. It's actually pretty good.
Yeah.
We got it issued to us the last time I did an FTX with ROTC, and they're pretty good. Like,
yeah,
like the tomato sauce had no flavor, but it was tomato sauce. And you're basically making a pizza with an MRE cracker. And like build it yourself.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of stuff that I like. What's in an MRE? I'd rather eat, like, give me something, one of those stews or mixed things that, you know.
There's this one company called MRE Nation, and they let you build your own MREs from different MRE packs, and you could do like one from a Korean MRE and put in like graham crackers if you want to do stuff like that.
We used to have this big cardboard box when I was in Iraq, because that's all we had for the first 2.5 months. And people would just, you know, they take what they wanted.
Yeah.
And throw the extra stuff that was in there.
My friend from his last deployment brought a whole box of the single serving Chick-fil-A sauces. And he was like a dealer, just dealing it out to everybody on deployment.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We're going to talk a little bit about the History of archaeology. All right, so history of archaeology. What do you think when did archaeology as a discipline emerge, do you think? Anyway.
Didn't it start when certain European kings and nobles started hunting for religious artifacts?
So there's some of that. There's some of like, let's bring back antiquities, religious artifacts. Yeah, so what are we talking about? Like, so yeah, high Middle Ages, you start to get people interested in especially manuscripts and religious objects and so on. But then also during the Renaissance, we start to get interest in antiquities as antiquities. And what that led to was a sort of looting approach to archaeology, right? So you're going to go somewhere, you're going to find everything you can, you're going to bring it home. And it's going to, yeah, exactly. Yeah, the British Museum, the German Museum, the Paris Museum, the Louvre, they were funded early on, but even before these museums, private individuals, kings, nobility, and random folk just wanted to have antiquities once it became sort of a mark of prestige and people were interested in them. So some of that was legitimate research interest in these antiquities. Some of it was just like, hey, I'm going to go dig up a bunch of antiquities and see if I can sell them. So people selling antiquities dealers that went around it, good stuff. That encouraged a sort of a market of looting. There was it grew up around that also from the beginning of interest in antiquities, the making of forgeries came right along with that. So archaeology, antiquity, and philology and forgery are all related, right? So if you're going to study these ancient things, you end up studying forgery as well.
Well, I haven't started with call it archaeology not, but trying to click those things with relics.
Mm-hmm. Relics could be kind of there's definitely religious gathering of items. Some of that happened around the same time as this interest in antiquity.
How did they know where to start digging?
Yeah, you want to go over there and start digging, and you want to find things and creating the Holy Land. But creating the Holy Land happened way before the Renaissance. So, and interest in finding the real cross, became a real big deal even in the late Roman Empire. So, but so for example, this is a little bit later, like 18th century, but when we carried out a real archaeological excavation of Pompeii, which was covered in volcanic ash and so on. But so this was a thorough excavation. We're going to dig, we're going to find what's there, we're going to report it. But that dig was mostly focused on getting the objects out of Pompeii, not recording where they were found or anything. And all of those Pompeii objects are still in places in Italy for the most part, but they weren't represented. And when you walk around Pompeii, it's empty. So they took all the things you could find and that were even architectural features and took them out.
So it's really more souvenir hunting than it is. I mean, archaeology is really, the purpose of it is to determine the past.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you're just collecting souvenirs, that's not really the purpose of collecting souvenirs. That's why when you do to grid things off and uncover now, take pictures of every single thing as you go.
Yeah, exactly. That came later though, because at first, it's really souvenir hunting. It is a love of antiquities, collections. People are collecting these things for various
You
reasons.
limit the utility thing. I mean, you can still probably ascertain from knowing that it came from that location, and then, you know, what it's made out of, things like that would allow you to extrapolate on, you know, something because you know the general location, but not knowing what it was with somewhat impairs
Yeah,
the interpretation.
for sure. Absolutely. That's exactly right. So it's really at first not a science so much, or an interest in preserving the past and marking it in the picture. Let's see. But more of a, that's really far out. So not. More of a taking of things and not so much of a preserving of things, right? So, and that gets taken up into, so one of the earliest, sometimes thought of as the first sort of true modern archaeologist was Flavio Biondo, the Italian humanist, who created a topography of ancient sites in Rome, so the 16th century. And so there he is. But he created a topography like, okay, we got all these ancient sites in Rome. We need to sort of mark out where they are and study them as they are there. So he was one of the first ones to talk about that. Napoleon, here's a painting of Napoleon, picturing him in the City of the Dead in Egypt. And Napoleon was fascinated by and really considered Egypt to be a major part of his own identity and a part of the identity of his France. And so he brought together a team of people who would help him study and excavate Egypt. And that team started at, I think 300 or so folks and grew to about 500 or so. So he invested a great amount of resources to Egyptian archaeology, and they brought all that stuff to him. So he had an enormous collection of things, and a lot of those things are still in France, and he used that as a part of his own representation of himself. Like, I am like a pharaoh of old, right? And we are like an Egypt, this new thing I'm doing in France, and sort of helped to create a sort of narrative around himself with the archaeology he's doing. And I point this out not only because it's sort of how archaeology has been used, but it is a thing that besets biblical archaeology to this day, right? So why is that? What are the potential issues that might come up that are very similar to the example of Napoleon you can think of for any archaeological dig in Israel today?
Framing,
What's that?
framing,
Yeah.
where you're trying to find something in archaeology instead of discover something.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go out looking for the city of Jericho and you find an ancient city, it's going to be Jericho.
Right.
But if you're framing it that way, it might be a completely different city.
Right. So sometimes you are committed to finding something and you want it to be more significant than it is. Good. That's great. What other things do you think come up with archaeology in Israel today?
Are there issues with like who owns these sites and you know what you can and can't take out of there as an archaeologist and or even access, you know, across political boundaries?
Yeah, so good. So there's major issues of contestation where Israeli archaeologists would really like to get in there and excavate the old city under the Dome on the Rock, for instance. Maybe find David's palace, and that's not going to happen. And why is that? Beyond the mere fact that Muslims would not like it if the Dome of the Rock were hurt, why does Israel want to discover David's palace so much? And why do Palestinians not want them to discover it so much? Is it an archaeological question, or what's going on there?
Well, it's political establishment. That's the basis for establishing Israel where it is.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you find the palace, it's evidence that Israel was a settlement, a nation state there. And if you don't find it, then the the Palestinian side would say, you don't have claim to this area.
Right. So every archaeological discovery in Israel affects the question of Israel's national identity and statehood and right to the land, and gets read in that way and has for a long time, right? So this is a real political thing where archaeology in Israel is often very motivated by showing Israel to have the longest claim and to sort of build up or create national pride. And that can, how might that affect the way the archaeology is done, right? So what does that mean for archaeological discovery and for like presentation of it?
Well, it's like having a vested interest. I mean, if you work for the pharmaceutical company and you do their research, I mean, not every study is flawed, but you have a vested interest.
Yeah, yeah. We joke that every single archaeological discovery in ancient Israel comes with its own press kit, you know, because you're immediately selling it. You know, it's not, and it'll happen the week after, the month after the thing is found. Whereas if you're doing a dig in some less hot spot, you know, Turkey or something, you might be excited about what you just discovered, but you're gonna like take 2 or 3 years to publish that thing, you know, in some cases. And so it's a little bit different because it's immediately played to the press. It goes immediately into questions of national identity. And that's just the national side, the political side. We also have the whole thing of people who are actively trying to make every single archaeological discovery prove that the Bible is exactly accurate, and people who have a vested interest in trying to show that the Bible is not historically accurate, both of which are not vested interests that people generally bring into archaeological things. So they're looking for discoveries. They're not trying to sort of prove something before they start out with it. Right. So
We also have issues, question, because people do things on the basis of a hypothesis, but if what they find doesn't fit the hypothesis, that could create problems. So
yeah,
let's say, oh, we're shutting down the site, nobody gets get in it, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
yeah, exactly. So that doesn't make, there's still a lot of very responsible and good digs done in Israel, but the whole history of biblical archaeology is informed by these questions fairly early on, where it's not merely a question of, hey, let's discover what this site tells us about this site, but let's use this bit of history, this antiquity, this thing to create something and see something about myself. Or my interests. Let's look down the well of archaeology and find my own reflection.
well, there's also though, I mean, there's a tension there too, because archaeology is like, it doesn't give you a lot of the pieces to the puzzle. So if you don't have something that you're looking at to put it into context, you can't really just build from all those pieces necessarily. You
It's
actually have to
difficult.
put context into it somewhere. And so I'm not sure what the people that don't want to prove the Bible are doing by that, maybe in a negative way, I guess, but people who are building the Bible are actually looking at their Bible picture to interpret these things, to see, and if they're honest, they're looking to see if they match or don't match.
Yep.
But they have to have that context. They're not just hypothetically saying, okay, I have these little pieces in here, and this looks like it might be this for me, so it's true.
Yeah.
Right. Use your imagination for whatever.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And that's why, because of the misuses of biblical archaeology, you could imagine that there's a lot of archaeologists that want to distance themselves from something like biblical archaeology. And if they were to teach this course, would say, call it the archaeology of the Levant, and feel pretty like tense about even bringing the Bible in as a text, right? But I agree with you, Bill, and not just because I'm a Catholic, but because I think it is an ancient text that we should be looking at in order to set a context for the archaeological finds. I agree. So you don't want to like have an agenda to prove everything when you're an archaeologist who's working on biblical stuff. But if it were any other text, if it were a text from Mesopotamia, that doesn't have all these fraud issues, we would definitely be using it to help us understand the archaeological site. And so you can't. I don't think it's irresponsible in another way just to sort of abandon the Bible as a source of historical information. So I think you're absolutely right on that.
But I don't think people do that anyways, right? We've built pictures of history based off of lots of things.
Yeah.
And we're not looking at this archaeology devoid of all of that historical interpretation, which may or may not be correct.
Yep, that's true.
So
it's always a hermeneutical question when you're looking at anything like this. It's not merely a scientific one. So that's good. And speaking of using text to discover things, here's William Dorpfeld on the upper left and Heinrich Schliemann. This is at the Lion Gate of Mycenae. But Schliemann is very famous for discovering the city of Troy, right? So the city of ancient Troy. And he actually used the Iliad, and he read the Iliad and he looked for clues, and people weren't sure that Troy existed for real. And people still debate about his site, right? But he used the Iliad, he read it very closely, and this is my example for archaeology as exploration. This is our Indiana Jones site. Well, Indiana Jones is mostly a looter, but sometimes he's an explorer, right? And a scholar. So here Schliemann is exploring where he's like, we don't know. We're not starting with a tell and then uncovering it and finding what we find there. No, we want to explore and go like a detective through the Iliad and look for clues for where this might have been. And then go there and see what we can find. And he did, found what is likely ancient Troy. And he was interested in uncovering it and documenting it, and not merely to loot it and take it home for prestige. So that's an example of archaeology as exploration. And that is as you're going to read in the book that I signed for the course, a very short intro to biblical archaeology. A lot of early archaeology in Israel was exactly this. Okay, here's the site described in the Bible. Here's where it ought to be. Here, let's see if we can find it. And we're going to do geographical surveys. We're going to do a quick dig and then confirm this is the site. And we're going to go over here. We're going to make big maps and we're going to figure this out. So that kind of exploration where you're sort of charting out the ancient onto the modern.
How Jericho.
Yeah, that's exactly how they found Jericho. Yeah, exactly how they found Jericho, which we'll talk more about. But yeah, they were looking around and they found it that way. They said it must be here, and there it was. Yeah. So yeah, starting with the text is often very helpful for these things as a part of the exploration. Archaeology is method. What we now think of as archaeology really developed a real major shift happened at the beginning of the 20th century. And one of the earliest people to be involved with this shift was a guy by the name of Flinders Petrie. And there are other people as well, but he was a British archaeologist who said, this needs to be about preservation, about discovering trying to understand it, try to date it, try to preserve it, make a detailed photographic record of every single thing as we find it, where we find it, and try to start to study pottery typology and really start to treat a site as a thing to be preserved rather than just to be found. Because any archaeological dig is a kind of destruction, right? You're taking apart something that's preserved and you're going to take it away eventually. But Petrie was like, okay, we need to record extensively everything that we find, preserve what we find in a very orderly and methodical fashion, and thereby use archaeology as a method by which we can understand history and preserve it. And that developed in ways you'll read about, and we'll talk a bit more about next week with respect to biblical archaeology during the 20th century, with, of course, a couple of major interruptions for the world wars. But people really took off with that. They developed stratigraphy. They developed these grid pattern of archaeology that Bill mentioned, where you're marking out squares so you can exactly annotate where you're finding things. And they really took this in a strong direction for what we now practice as modern archaeologists. Another person who took this to the next level, and you'll read a great deal about in the book, is Dame Kathleen Kenyon. She was huge in the archaeology of the Levant, and she took methodological rigor to the next level. She developed some digging techniques that you'll read about that I'll talk about next week, that are still used to this day. And she also opened up to the increasing use of archaeology as an interdisciplinary discipline and explanation of things. For a while there, so we moved from archaeology as sort of a taking of things and collecting of things to archaeology, and archaeology as sort of an exploration of things, to archaeology as a recording of things. Here's the what, right? Here are all the pots. Here's where we found them. And here's maybe the dates. But eventually, archaeologists got a little restless with that and said, we can actually contribute to the why as well, not just the what. So why did the pottery change? Why did this people die out? And to do that, they started bringing in folks who were like experts in metallurgy, experts in pottery formation, experts in food, right? Where you study the remains of the food that are left and do DNA analysis and that kind of thing. And you can, as an archaeologist, you can specialize in all those things. You can bring in other people with those things. You can study bones, right? And how to interpret and analyze bones and grave sites. So it really burgeoned out as to not just digging up things and recording them, but a real thoroughgoing mix of the humanities and science to try to explain what's happening. Even if you don't have a text, here is why things changed the way they did at this site, which is kind of where we're at now. We go to an archaeology conference.
Now they're going to be criticizing them.
What's that?
50 years from now, they're going to be criticizing people now and saying, you shouldn't have just brushed that stuff away. We could have tested it. So
That's right. We could have tested it a little bit.
And we could have told you 50 days about it. Now we can't do it anymore.
So with archaeology in the beginning stages of like the site, does it really begin with assumption and then you start adding in the context clues from around the area to, like, I assume that this was a temple. Let me see if that assumption is correct.
Yeah, a lot more of that kind of thing. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep.
But you have to have something that indicates it was a temple in the first place.
There's always going to be a bit of that. There's a desire to make it as scientific as possible, but as a good humanist myself, I would say with things like this, especially with history, and really even with just chemistry or whatever else, the human element of interpretation and framing can't be avoided. We can't get rid of it. That's part of what it means to be human. So you're always interpreting, but yes, there is a real effort to bring in technology, to be extremely slow. earlier archaeological digs were very fast, very destructive. You have 500 people working on the site. You'd be like digging up the whole thing and carrying it out. Sometimes you miss stuff. Like they've had archaeologists go back to earlier archaeological sites and do a dig on the piles of dirt they left behind and find important texts and things because they just missed it. So now archaeological digs are very slow. They take a decade to get down several layers that they used to be done in a matter of weeks. But they also have, this isn't on the slide, but there are also what we call rescue excavations, right? Where, say, recently there was a village, a Native American village, I can't remember which group, found in Miami where they're about to build a new development. And so, of course, the developers are not going to stop the development for 10 years for an archaeologist to do a proper analysis of that site. But they did pause. There's enough outcry from people in the area to say, okay, we need to do something. So they bring in a sort of rescue excavation, and they do a quick and ready archaeological preservation of the site as much as they can. There was another, there's other developments that we can talk about that are also relevant for our stuff, like underwater archaeology. That's another major subset where you look at shipwrecks or just stuff that was assimilated by various oceans as the water rose. So all kinds of stuff. But I want to move on to some basic archaeological terms, just to make sure we're all on the same page with that. We've got what we call a tell. This is really important for the archaeology of the Middle East in particular, but not only. And so if you looked at that, you might just be like, okay, that's a hill. Look at the hill. But what this is, and that's what people thought for a long time, until they figured this out. But what these mounds, these hills and sometimes it'd be covered with grass and the whole thing. What these are in these sites are cities that have perished, right, and no longer exist, that were built on top. They were built and rebuilt enough that they created layers over time. So the hills are man-made. This is particularly prevalent in the ancient Middle East, where there's lots of clay houses and clay buildings. Was when the buildings would break, they would just pound the clay into the floor of the next building, right? When they're rebuilding, they don't like take all of the previous city out of the city and get rid of it. They would just sort of burn it down a little more, stamp it in, mix it up, and it becomes the next layer of the city, which is really handy for preserving things for archaeologists. And sometimes, say if a city gets attacked and burned, destroyed, and then later someone comes back and restarts it. Sometimes in that destruction layer is when texts get lost. But since in Mesopotamia in particular, they're written on clay tablets. Clay tablets don't disintegrate in fire, right? They're preserved even more in fire. So they would then sometimes get burned, but they then get pushed down into the bottom layer and then built on top of. And so underneath floors and so on, you find texts. So tells are this kind of thing where you are got a hill, but on the hill is the hill's been created by the buildup of civilization on that spot over millennia, and you can then take it down and find the different layers of people that lived on that spot. That's what a tell is. This is Megiddo in Israel.
Does it have to be a hill, or is the fact that because there's a lot of places where you wouldn't necessarily notice a hill, but the same dichotomy takes place, and it's just layer on layer on layer.
Absolutely. Thanks. Yeah, I'm saying hill because it looks like a hill in this picture, but no, it's not always a hill-like structure, and it's not a hill, it's a tell. But a tell doesn't always look like a hill. That's right.
How do they know when they've got to the bottom?
What's that?
How do they know when they've got to the bottom of the tell?
Usually because you stop seeing man-made substances and you start to go into like the soil that you would find in other parts of. So they'll do soil testings, right? To start off, they might take one tiny spot and go all the way to the bottom and test the layers as they encounter it. And
Okay.
usually, once you move past what would be identified as sort of man-made type influence soil, and you get into just the soil that's the same as the thing down the road that is not a tell, then you know. Yeah.
Actually, I saw an excavating graphic once where they were actually excavating from the bottom.
That can happen, yeah.
Because they didn't want to disturb what was on top, so
Mhm.
they were excavating from the bottom to keep things.
And that's the excavations that they have done over under the wall in Israel. That's the method they've used. It's controversial because they aren't supposed to be doing it at all. But yeah, that does happen, especially if you want to go try to find things underneath a major city. Aleppo is the site of our, I'm gonna make sure I get this right. Aleppo is Yamhad. Yeah, Aleppo is Yamhad, not Katna. So we could go find out a bunch about Yamhad at Aleppo, but it's a current city, right? People live there, so we can't do as much as we like. So you could do a little bit underneath. This is Megiddo. This is a site that was run by the University of Chicago for many decades, and it is. You can see that here on the sides, it's at what looks like a hill, but as they excavated, they're finding the stuff underneath the layer, the city plans, the walls, that kind of thing.
Subway.
Oh yeah, and unintentional discoveries with subways, with laying foundations for buildings. This is why every state in America has an archaeologist on staff. In case when you're building, you discover something. It's the same thing for most countries. You accidental discoveries of stuff is quite common. This is an example of stratigraphy. Which is the same kind of thing that you encounter with geoscience, where you can date. It's not that the world had the Earth for a long time. They thought of the Earth as being undisturbed except for catastrophes. But in modern geology, we know that there are layers of the Earth as we pass through time, which we call stratigraphy. And that is a way of understanding rock formation and soil formation and dating the various portions of the Earth, even without any sort of man-made stuff going on, right? Elizabeth.
I took a summer course through Albany University.
Yeah.
And I was teaching back in the early 2000s, and we took a field trip. It happened to be out on geography and did fantastic things. We went to Thatcher Park, and Thatcher Park in Lower Albany County is exactly what you're talking about. We can see the layer of fossils and coral that was there on top of all the different ones. So it's just fascinating when you actually see it in person.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, and this is a feature of the Earth in general, and then of tells also, because of what we just talked about, people building one thing up on top of the other. And this is a photo from an archaeological tell where you've got, your grass, and then you've got soil underneath with clay plaster sort of mixed in. And you've got a reddish substance, and then it gives a different color. You can start to see and identify with, of course, more precise methods than the naked eye, the layers of the tell you're digging up through stratigraphy. The grid that Bill mentioned is a way of marking out a site. This is a cute little graphic here that I happen to find, but the grid is usually a little bigger than this, but not always. So you might take the entire site and put it in 5x5 grids, like she's working on there, and then divide those even further, like they've done there. So but you might not divide those even further. And then you've got your stuff, your sketch pad for making notes, your sieve for going through the dirt. You're taking up very carefully your camera bowl to make sure you're excavating at a proper rate. And then off to the side, you have a table for sorting artifacts usually. It's a pretty common setup. And then you've got your spoil heap where you're taking, after you take samples of each thing, but you're not going to take all the dirt home with you. So you are usually creating a dirt spoil heap on side. After you run all the soil, all the things that you're excavating, all the dirt, all the dust through a sieve to make sure you're not missing anything, you would deposit it out there. And then behind us, a mound, a possible city site that is not being excavated. Oh, and a helpful graphic. So so a grid is how you take a site, a tell, and divide it all up, and you would apportion it out. Here's section ABC, but we're all going to work within these squares, right? So we have a square director, or a square supervisor. You get a site director and a square supervisor and a digger. If you go with me to Jordan, we will all be just diggers. And but a square supervisor would be someone who's a trained archaeologist, but not the director, who can make sure that each square is being excavated appropriately. So that's how that would go. So that's a grid, and then a plan is what happens after you get back. I actually, for example, we're going to look at some plans as we go through the course. The plan is like, okay, here's what we've discovered so far. Here's a sort of sketch out of what's been excavated, and you do a plan for each season of a dig. That's sort of your report when you get home. So those are your basic concepts. And now I want to do a little bit more discussion on the archaeology of the Levant. So we have our region here. Okay, so we've got Levant is in this part of the world, and you can see how the Tigris and Euphrates running up through here, the Arabian Desert down through here, which is not a major site of civilization. And so here's Mesopotamia meeting up with Syria, and then coming down into Israel and or sort of modern day Israel and Palestine, all the way down here where we have the Philistine cities. And this is the Sinai Peninsula out here. But so this is kind of where you're going to find all your major cities along this green zone, where you get your water sources and so on. We've got our mountains and rivers going on. We've got the Orontes Mountains, and then down through here, the Lebanon mountain range, which is important for Israel and through Syria, where you've got the cedars of Lebanon that are going to be on these mountains. And then the plain down here where over Carchemish, where there's several famous battles of people coming from Mesopotamia down through here. And then down in this region, we've got Israel along here. So these are the highlands where we start to see Israel emerge in the Iron Age. So here's some climatic zones and mineral resources. So I'm not going to go a great deal into those, but here are the provinces of the Persian Empire. And so when the Persians take over, they sort of divide things up, and these provinces stick for the most part for a long time. So we have Assyria up here, we've got Cilicia, which is still mentioned in, say, Paul's letters. We've got, as Cilicia, we've got Lydia, we've got Iona, and then Egypt down here, Arabia, Libya. These are all Persian designations. And this region is the 5th satrapy of Herodotus, as he describes his Persian division, called Aber Nahara, beyond the river. This is what we're talking about when we talk about the Levant, this region right here. The Euphrates River is a major source of this area on its westernmost border. So the Euphrates River comes up here. And this is what this looks like. This beautiful river going up into the mountains. And we've got a lot of subsistence agriculture and farming and shepherding of flocks that's happening from the very outset of what we think of as Israel and throughout the even time before that and to this very day. It's a land that supports this kind of agriculture pretty well, but it's not like overflowing with incredible resources for wheat and stuff like Mesopotamia on the one hand, or Egypt on the other. Now, if you look at the back of your syllabus, I didn't try to replicate this on slides because it's so extensive, but I gave you at the very final page of your syllabus, I gave you a timeline of the ancient Near East as it relates to the Levant, showing each period as it goes along. If that helps you to see that all laid out, that's on the last page of the syllabus. You can pull it up now on your computer, or you can print that out eventually. But and we're not going to talk a great deal about anything beyond. Next week, we're going to talk about the late Bronze Age collapse, and then we're going to move to the Iron Age. So we'll spend most of our time in the Iron Age. So I'm only going to give you an overview of stuff that was led up to the period that we are dealing with tonight. Just a real quick overview, not anything that you have to think about memorizing or anything. Just want to give a broad idea. So in pre-pottery Neolithic, which is 83 to 5500 BC, you have a basic change from food gathering to food production. And we've got the culture of the Levant, still largely homogeneous. We don't have a bunch of different folks going on. So when we do archaeology this time period, you start to see food production. You start to see crops going up in this region. The pre-pottery Neolithic A, that first part of this period, is best documented at Jericho in Jordan Valley. And you've got round or oval houses about 4 or 6 meters in diameter. It's characterized by hogback mud bricks with flat bottom and convex back. And it's got massive protective walls and round stone tower, which is famously talked about in the Bible, and botanical evidence of agriculture, barley, wheat, and lentils and legumes. This is your way before what we're talking about. Israel is, emergence in 1000 BC. But in Jericho, we've got this evidence for the pre-pottery Neolithic period, these kinds of things. Here's a stone tower from Jericho in this period.
Jericho was found underneath the Dead Sea, correct?
What's that?
Jericho was found in the Dead Sea, correct?
Yeah. Okay. Well, near, right? Not, yeah. The Neolithic period is, right. In pre-pottery Neolithic A, we've got cereal agriculture with wheat, 2-row barley, double-row emmer wheat, And I won't go through, this is a pretty detailed slide, which I'm not going to go through all the way, but this is the kind of thing that we can talk about in terms of, are we having serial agriculture that's not just collecting wheat, but creating a kind of wheat? And so when you do analysis of this stuff, which is kind of the method that people are using now to solve these questions, we've got a brittle rachis for easy seed dispersal for the wild versions, but you have domestication starting to take place for a natural tough rachis so that you can control it more, right? And have longer lasting wheat crops. So this is what you can see about that. So there's the wild and versus the domestic wheat and domestic and wild corn. The wild wheat looks a little bigger, but the point is that it's less controllable, it's more brittle, the stuff's going everywhere, and then the wild corn is bred to produce more corn. And you get more seeds there for the domestic wheat as well. So this is the kind of thing you look at to talk about, okay, what happens, what's happening with humans now in this area, and that's what we're seeing. This next period, pre-pottery Neolithic B, in 7200 to 5500, we get herding, the domestication of sheep and goats and cattle, population increase and expansion of settlement, and many large sites, including southern Jordan. And we're starting to get evidence of trade contacts like obsidian from Anatolia and bitumen from the Dead Sea. We're starting to get rectangular houses made with elongated mud brick instead of the short hogback mud brick, and the extensive use of polished clay plaster for statues and skulls. Here is a plastered skull. So polished clay plaster to preserve the skull, and that is a plastered skull from Jericho. This is at Ein Gazal in the Transjordan, and this is the nearby where we're gonna dig next summer, so relevant. We've got plaster statuettes, and these are about 90 centimeters tall and modeled on a core of reeds. That's the kind of thing they're making out of plaster. There's the find site on the left, and there's the object on the right. So pottery Neolithic is defined by its introduction of pottery. And it's probably arose during this experimentation with clay plaster that you see here. And if you took an accidental fire in a sunken clay basin, you would have hardened it, and suddenly you're starting to get pottery. Pottery is a sensitive indicator of culture variation. You've got local preferences for shape and decoration in time and space. And you've got simple handmade vessels with limited range of shapes: bowls, deep craters, mixing bowls, storage bars, and small closed jars. And here we have Yarmoukyan, red, brown, slip, and zigzag bands, which is a kind of pottery that once you've identified it enough Neolithic sites that are dated Neolithic for other reasons, you can start to also use the particular kind of pottery you find there, especially relative to other kinds of pottery you find there, as a way of understanding the development. Here's the Yarmoukyan phase, an object made out of clay here, the Lady of Munkhata, a more advanced statue than you find here. Both of them are pretty weird looking, but fascinating. This is fertility, and this is a very common theme in a lot of the region where you have the woman displaying her breasts. It's a fertility. It's like a thing you would keep in your house to have a baby. The Gasulian culture is something that comes up during this time. The Gasulian, its type site is Tulayat al Gasul, which is 5 kilometers northeast of the Dead Sea. You also get variants in the northern Negev, the north of Israel, and the Golan Heights, which are also north of Israel, right across from Jordan. And it's very different settlement distribution. The sites are located along wadi banks and peripheral zones, and you've got large, densely built, unfortified villages with some variation in site sizes. So these slides, I hope they're remaining interesting and not overwhelming. They're designed to show the various kinds of things that you can bring to bear on archaeological questions, right? So we're talking about wheat, we're talking about evidence of animals, we're talking about pottery, we're talking about house sizes and shapes, we're talking about the way that figurines are made, and we're also talking about where the sites are. Why are they building here? Whereas they used to build over here. Here's some Beersheba Chalcolithic stuff, development of various objects here. And some Abu Matar Chalcolithic. There's that brown red pottery type. And the Byblos Chalcolithic. And they start to work with ivory. So we have these ivory figurines here. Early precursor to the science of the lands and center there. And all right, and here's some wall paintings, beautiful wall paintings. Cave art is one of the most fascinating topics in the world, and I'd love to just take 2 weeks on cave art. But we're not going to because it's way before our time period. And now, the most exciting thing ever, the secondary products revolution. This is the use of animals at the end of the Chalcolithic period for traction power, milk, and wool. It's actually much later than their original use for domestication. So first you're just keeping them for meat. And when it occurs to you that you're going to use them to help you do the crops for milk and to make your clothes, that's what we call the secondary products. So it's not just the animal's meat, but there's secondary benefits to you as well. There's large herds. There's the way the butchering schedule, which you can tell from bones and stuff, indicates the animals were used on other things other than meat. There's a need to keep herds away from the crop fields during the winter, and pastoral specialists emerged. So we have a dimorphic society. Whereas before, every person has their field and their animals and their, whatever they've got right there for each village or probably each person. Now we have shepherds and farmers, dimorphic society, right? So beginning of specialization. And then we've got the Lady of, here's a couple examples, the Lady of Galat here, this sheep up top. Here's a copper hoard from Nahal Mishmar, which is interesting because you're starting to see metallurgy and you're starting to see a little more complex work. Here is a temple in Engedi. And we start to get some burial practices, primary and secondary burial to long-range pastoralism, where you would bury someone, but then bring them with you in an ossuary, and eventually bury them again. Can anyone think of someone whose bones were kept in an ossuary and for a long time and then brought to a different space in the Bible?
Joseph.
Joseph is who I was thinking of. Yep, Joseph. Joseph said, "Don't let my bones stay in Egypt. When you go into the promised land, take my bones with you." And then they do, according to the narrative. So this is not just him or anything strange, but you keep your bones in an ossuary and then eventually bury them where they're supposed to be buried. And you have,
Not a bone?
yeah, 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 yeah. So you've also got elaborate decoration of clay ossuaries, which are shaped like houses with human noses and often buried in groups. So we can start to really play around with like, okay, this is Chalcolithic, it's before text, so we don't have a lot to go on, but you start to wonder, hey, maybe this is a social identity status kind of thing. Here's an example. There's a ossuary built like a house up on the left. And here's one with a nose on the right. See the two eyes and the nose sticking out. So those are boxes used for bones, Chalcolithic period. All right, so now we're getting into more comfortable territory, the early Bronze Age, urban civilization in Mesopotamia, Proto-Literate, early dynastic, Akkadian, Ur III, and at the same time, and those dates may not match exactly the dates on the other slides, I hope they do, but they may not. And I made these slides in an earlier period. I made those other slides today. So, this matches to Egypt with the pre-dynastic period, the proto-dynastic period, early Old Kingdom, and First Intermediate period. So this is the Bronze Age. In Mesopotamia, we've got early dynamism, the Sumerian city-states, eventually the rise of the Akkadians, Sargon and Naram-Sin, and then back to the Sumerians with the Earth III period. We've got some back and forth between Sumer, who are not Semitic people. They're their own kind of people. They have an isoglossic language, which means it's not part of a language family that's known. And they are the original folk there, the Sumerians. But then they get taken over by the Akkadians, and they are going back and forth for a period there. That's what's happening in Mesopotamia. And you get different dynasties creating the first major kingdom in Egypt, the Old Kingdom, and then the fall of the Old Kingdom into this sort of chaotic intermediate period. This is the early Bronze Age. The Euphrates region of the Levant is influenced by Mesopotamia, and the coastal and southern Levant are influenced by Egypt. And they're doing a lot of trade with Egypt in the south, and a lot of trade with Mesopotamia in the northeast. In the early Bronze Age, these Chalcolithic settlements in the desert fringe are abandoned, and you've got new villages founded in inland valleys and foothills. And then you've got regional ceramic cultures going on. Kenyon here, Kathleen Kenyon, was extremely important in the development of pottery as a way to understand what's happening in the sort of that use of explanation. So not just here's a pot and here's where we found it, but what does this pot say about the development of things that are going on? She named these ceramic cultures Proto-Urban ABC, and thought that they were successive. So she explained these potteries as historical development. Now, due to a little bit more archaeology that's happened, more sites and more data about the layers, people don't think of them as successive, but as overlapping. We've lost my computer, it died. So I'm gonna bring them back in this fashion. Sorry, we had a minor technical problem on site, but they're overlapping now. And this is, again, not something we will be remembering, but I just want you to encounter it a little bit. So don't stress about the info, but these are your Proto-Urban C Our gray burnished ware is located in central and northern regions, Israel Valley, Jordan Valley, Transjordan, and maybe Anatolian. Proto-urban A is red burnished ware everywhere, overlapping C. And proto-urban B is in the central, it's a lion group painted ware in Central Highlands in the south. That's like where Israel is gonna show up eventually. And proto-urban D is impressed / ware in central and southern Palestine and Transjordan.
So we kind of like when we, someone was looking back at our age, and they found a flip phone.
Yeah.
They found a BlackBerry, or they found, you know, working way up.
Yeah. You have to be careful. These things are really useful, but archaeologists always have to be sensitive that a lot of things could be going on. If you were to go into my house, you could probably find. So my wife likes these South American, I can't think of the artist, but they're naked ladies from South America. They're all over our house. And then we've got like my stuff from the Middle East, but then like Chicago White Sox hat as well. And then like, so what are you gonna make? And then we got Catholic symbols everywhere. But what are you gonna make of our culture if you come into our house? So a lot of different things. And that can be true. But of course, this is a wider spread, so there's more evidence. But yeah, it can be difficult to know for sure.
Cultures that thrive on their traditions or things would linger longer.
Yeah, people try to also like argue from names on what kind of religion people were practicing. But that, as we know from our modern time, is also tricky because you can have a Christian name and not be a Christian. You can be named Christian and not be a Christian. So, all right. So, on the right here we have this gray burnished ware, Beth Yirah, and then some examples of a house in this period as well.
Professor, I had one question going back to when you were doing the climate maps.
Yeah.
Has there been much study or evidence of climate change, vegetation change in this area? Mainly that it would have been more fertile and more lush than it is now.
Yeah, that's commonly accepted as being the case. Yeah.
But do they have maps or anything to show, like, where you're digging, over time?
Yeah, I think they do. That's something I'll come back to. That's a great question, Rod.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. That's something I'll come back to because I think there probably is more than I'm showing.
Actually, a lot of this stuff would be probably easier to use for elimination purposes than it would be compilation. For instance, if you know that a technology hadn't developed by a certain time, it has to be before that. Whereas if you find something that's old, you can't necessarily say that it, it spans a wider time.
Absolutely true. When you get to this period too, you get the urban settlements, which are going to be really important for when we talk about the switch, because the Bronze Age is really defined by large walled towns, right? So this is our basic type of structure in this period, large walled towns that eventually are all going to fall and be abandoned right before Israel emerges in the highlands, right? So that's like the late Bronze Age collapse. What collapses is what we find beginning in the early Bronze Age, the urban settlements with thick stone walls, temples, public works, and villages being abandoned and people becoming urban. So it's a big time of urbanization throughout the Bronze Age. You can see some of this like at Arad here, even something was abandoned. When you dig this up, this is a major wall that you've got going to protect the city. So you can see these, and here's a map of Arad. So you've got a wall all the way around, and then you've got the city behind it. And this this you can remember from all that we just covered. The Bronze Age defined by major walled cities. And then when we get to Israel next week and the collapse of all this, it's going to be these cities that are abandoned. Here's what a house would look like in Arad, this broadroom house where you get your cooking areas out here and your roof areas in here with the broad rooms behind it, sleeping and so on. This is an Arad house. And some pottery in a room from Arad. And here's your red polished ware, light face painted ware. And these were actually found in Egypt, so they're but they're characteristic of the Levant's period. They were exported. Yeah, so that's kind of, I'll leave you with that. This is, I've given you a lot here. I don't want to overwhelm you, but well, let me just point out, this is, once we get into the late Bronze Age and Middle Age, you start to get tablets in this area. Ebla I mentioned, which is up in northern Syria. You've got tablets from there. Here's a tablet from Ebla. And you've got some beautiful art coming up now. Here's all art found at Ebla. This is all Levantine art. And Ashkelon becomes a Philistine city eventually, but in the middle of Bronze Age, Philistines aren't there yet, and it is got a major rampart coming up to the city. And so here is a topographic plan of the Tell. So as people are excavating Ashkelon, they're doing this topography before they even begin with sonar and so on.
So that big gritting is what you're identifying.
Yep.
Plan,
Yep.
and then micro gritting.
Yeah. Exactly. Each one. Yeah. And so here's the actual site going on. This is a photograph from the dig. It's a shipment down here doing the dig. And the dig team over here and the sort of topographic map. This is what a site will be done now in this modern era. Ashkelon was late 20th century dig. So yeah, here's a artistic rendition of what Ashkelon would have looked like in the Middle Bronze Age. Walled city, major things going on within, and port, and then routes in and out. That's Ashkelon. So again, something that gets destroyed at the end of the late Bronze Age. Here's the Middle Bronze Gate at Dan. Becomes an Israelite city. A beautifully preserved gate there. It's stone, another walled city, and cut tomb at Gezer with some burials there. Middle Bronze Age high place. If you read through the Book of Kings, you'll encounter over and over and over God telling Israel to get rid of the high places. This is one such high places where you've got the matzebot, which are standing stones where you would pour libations and maybe you have an altar nearby. They're marks of communing with the divine, with some God. And this is Gezer. So this is an example. Physical and spiritual, yeah, this is where you go. And these existed in Israel by evidence of biblical text all the way through Josiah. So they were a major feature. And they were, the matzebot are also mentioned in the Bible as something that they tear down eventually. But this was long before Israel, Middle Bronze Age. People were doing this. Part of the religion of that area. Here's a Middle Bronze Age temple at Shechem and the Aleppo Citadel, massive thing there, and a Mari wall painting. This is all from the Levant. And Ebla again. This is the model of the temple. and the gate, and some orthostats from the gate, and some Middle Bronze Age pottery from Ebla. Really, you can see this Bronze Age is characterizing the region by increased specialization. Now you've got pots that you just aren't making, but you've got artisans that are making these pots. So we move from dimorphic to complete urban society where you've got people specializing in a variety of things, including pottery. You've got priests that are specializing in sacrifices. You've got farmers. You've got viticulture. You've got the development of the wine and oil, olive and oil, and these things that are part of life. This is an important part comes in the Middle Bronze Age. Pottery from Akko, some bowls, carinated bowls, and jugs, and all kinds of stuff. This comes from Middle Bronze Jericho. I love this one. This is a jar, but it's a jar with a very friendly face. Reminds me of my grandfather. Again, emphasizing the specialization. More from Middle Bronze Jericho. And Gezer. And here we have famous depictions of Baal. So Baal here, he's holding the king down here. And here he is on the right. And this is, he's standing above the sea in this picture. And so it seems to have conquered the sea as this picture, as is typical of the storm god. And here he's just blessing folks. That's Baal, famously. The Bible depicts Baal as a major rival of Israel's God. And that Baal is probably the Phoenician Baal, brought along by Jezebel. But a Phoenician princess who married the Israel king. But this is Baal from way before then, in the Middle Bronze Age. He's been around a long time. And this is probably Ale. So we've got Baal and we got Ale. Baal is depicted as a storm god. Ale is depicted as a calf here. This is discovered at Ashkelon, and also depicted as a seated deity, whereas Baal is usually standing and striding. When you read your portions for this week, you're going to read a little bit of the Ugaritic Baal myth, and you'll see Baal as this young guy who's trying to make a name for himself, and Ale as the dad, the head of the pantheon, who is gonna decide who the strongest prince is gonna be. Is it gonna be Baal? Is it gonna be Yam, the sea or the storm god? So Ale is Baal's striding usually, and Ale is sitting. He is the head. He doesn't need to stride. So he is the sort of father god, and Baal is more like the prince in the Ugaritic pantheon. So that's what we'll stop there. That's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of things to process. This is all sort of the background to what we'll talk about next week, which is the late Bronze Age period, which is this great area of diplomacy where you've got Ugarit, Hatti, Egypt, Mesopotamia, all working together with extremely prestige culture stuff where they're sharing all these goods with each other, trading back and forth, and creating diplomatic relationships with high levels of specialization in art. And then suddenly, due to a variety of factors, it all falls apart and becomes nothing. Egypt is the only thing that survives. Everyone else recedes in to a great extent, while Mesopotamia survives, but not in the same way. Hatti is completely destroyed. All these Middle Bronze cities that we just looked at, they're making cool stuff and have big walled cities, they're all destroyed and abandoned. and some of them never come back. And Ugarit is one of them. It's terribly sad. And by what? That's the question. Yeah, by what is the question? There's definitely a military component, but it seems not to be the only one. So it's probably the sea people. So we'll come back and talk about that on next week. And that's the sort of setting the stage for the emergence of Israel, which we'll also talk about next week. But Israel is part of this culture. We already see aspects of what we find in the Bible, you know, a good 1,000 or so years before Israel emerges as a place that people are living. And they share a common language. They speak common language, the Semitic language, with the rest of these folks going back thousands of years. And they deal with people worshiping the same gods that they're not supposed to, Baal and so on. And they have similar practices. They build similar things, and they're a part of this whole world as a human, as humans. That's what they're a part of. That's their life. So we'll come back to it. Any questions? Any other thoughts before we head out?
Yeah, I had a question about,
Yeah.
So the Jericho in the Neolithic, you said that wasn't considered urban yet?
Yeah, more of a village. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but it becomes a major urban center. Yeah.
Is that just because of the size, or is it?
Yeah. So when we talk about urbanization, we're usually saying it's more than there's a certain number of people, and we have permanent dwellings behind a wall where lots of people are living in their streets, and there's special people doing special things. Yeah, but it's the same site, but it's turned from a sort of village where people are mostly coming in and out, semi-nomadic. They stay there a while, then they leave, come back, and they have, sheep and goats and some fields, but nothing real substantial, to like a major, huge fortified city. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. That's a fantastic question. Thank you.
Professor?
Yeah.
Using the Bible as a text, Abram coming from Ur, going into, on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. While it's the same area, it is quite a distinct area. He's going to a different place. Is that fair to say?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So, I mean, are you going to be addressing that? I mean, that's kind of like coming in with different ideas to a new place.
Oh, yeah. So he was coming from Ur, so he's coming from Mesopotamia, and then settling in Canaan, right? So settling in the Levant. So he would have, if we were to follow that line, he would have spoken an East Semitic language, Akkadian, instead of the West Semitic language. It would have been similar enough that you can understand the language they were speaking there, something like Amorite. Some folks who, early folks who were talking about this, described Abraham as potentially an Amorite, right? He may have been part of the groups of Amorites that lived in northern Mesopotamia, but freely traveled back and forth between sort of that northwest corner of Mesopotamia and the Levant, and down into Egypt and conquering Egypt. And so some posit that he might have been one of those pastoral Amorites who then would have spoken a much similar language to the place where he was going. And then, in terms of what we find, so we expect that we would also expect Israel to come out of Egypt with a ton of Egypt culture, right? Because they lived there for 400 years. But what we find in the northern highlands and the archaeological sites, in the eventual artistic culture, in the language and the religious practices that are represented in the biblical text, we do not find strong Egyptian influence or strong Mesopotamian influence. We find something very coherent within the world of the Levant. So that's all, we have. That's all we can say. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Yep. Thank you, everybody. I have had fun. I hope you've had fun. If you have any questions, concerns, or thoughts, please send me an email. If you were terribly bored and hoped for a different direction, please send me an email. I don't have a fragile ego. My job is pretty secure. So I would like to make you happy just because I want to, because I'm a nice guy. So please let me know if you feel overwhelmed in any way. And, or, you want more. That was not enough. We need more pictures. Let me know. Happy to have feedback. And I hope you all have a great week. I'll see you next Tuesday.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Night.
All right.
So, I mean, we're sort of, you're doing sort of